Janine. I'm definitely not Janine. I have a much bigger, louder voice. So Sue introduced it perfectly. I'm going to talk about the Janine's 3D geophysical modeling, talking about the deep nature of the Bushveld. So just like all the other talks, we use a variety of data sets to try to understand the distribution of the thickness of the Bushveld and the rest of the crust, geologic map. So Janine used all these different data sets to try to constrain models. The greens here are showing the Rustenburg, the layered mafic portion of the complex. These are granites here, Transvaal Basin here. So Janine did a different approach. She did a forward model that was very carefully done using all the geologic data and density data, and would change the different horizons to try to match the gravity data. And yet you'll see the results are pretty similar. These are her thickness of the Rustenburg layered suite and the depths to the top. And it overlaps here with the model I showed you earlier, the ones that I did with using inversion. And considering how skeptical I am about the thicknesses, I'm amazed at how well the models actually match. And it's a good test. Sees the Mokopane feeder, very thick, as the inversions show, thicker here, thinner here, just like in the model that I did. Difference in thickness is about 1 kilometer. So she also shows thicknesses along the Thabazimbi-Murchison lineament, also down here near the Sugarbush fault. Average thickness is about 5 or 6 kilometers, as I mentioned earlier, thinning over here. Here's the depth to the top, important for exploration. Most of the northern lobe is within the upper 2 kilometers. This is from my paper, but it is elevation, but really it's also within the upper 2 kilometers. So these are pretty close. You see it's much deeper here, or possibly non-existent right here. So one of the important outcomes of these 3D models is shown here, where the orange line here and here are the observed gravity, and the object of the modeling is to get a model that matches that. And that's the blue line. On the edges, you get edge effects, so you don't always model it. But in order to be able to model the gravity data, Janine, and not have a ridiculously thick Bushveld complex shown here in green, you needed high densities in the lower crust. And here's the Thabazimbi-Murchison lineament hitting this high density material. Here's the edge of the craton. This is the Palala shear zone. This is Zimbabwe craton to the north. And similarly, along this profile, we see Janine's proposed feeder down here, also over required high densities in the lower crust. Okay, so how do we know what's in the lower crust? Well, there are seismic receiver functions that tell us about the crust overall. So these what you see here is average throughout the crust. Shows that beneath the Bushveld, which is indicated by these black lines, the crust is quite thick. The VP-VS ratio is high, which indicates more mafic rocks. Here's the average crustal density, crustal VP-VS ratio, so it's high. Also, the reflections from the moho are very diffuse underneath the Bushveld. So it's a very distinctive area from the perspective of these seismic receiver functions. So Janine took all of these observations. She put 1 over VP-VS to make the colors work. Moho sharpness, depth to moho in these kind of colors. And what you see is a pretty distinctive area in this ternary diagram underneath the Bushveld. So altogether, it's saying, yeah, this crust is quite different than most of the other places around it. And if you look at all of South Africa, it really stands out. So what does it tell us? So there's weak P to S conversions under the Bushveld. What does that mean? It means there's a diffuse crust mantle transition, which indicates there's a small velocity contrast between the lower crust and the upper mantle, which indicates probably high velocity, so mafic lower crust makes the most sense. How mafic is the crust away from the Bushveld? Well, this is seismic work right near in Kimberley, way outside the Bushveld, which is here. Shows the lower crust as intermediate composition. If you look at another seismic experiment, lower crust is felsic granulate. All these things point to the lower crust being special underneath the Bushveld. All right, well, how do we tell about the lower crust? So this is a model that I did. Very, very broad brush. I'm surprised it worked as well as it did. The input model was simple. We just put in said, if we want to fit the gravity anomaly, let's see what we have to do to just fit it with reasonable densities in the crust for just the layered mafic intrusion. So in the inversions, we let this top surface move a teeny bit and let this bottom surface move. And this is the result. The shapes look like what you see in the previous models, but look at these thicknesses. They're all over 20 kilometers. We know that the Bushveld is not 20 kilometers thick. So this is the indication if you ever see these models and people haven't included the lower crust for these big intrusions and they're very thick, it's probably not all there, but it indicates it's someplace else. Now, the gravity data can allow high densities anywhere in this column. We don't, once we see that it's not all in here, it can be in lower crust, it can be in the middle crust. Seismic data tell us at least some of it's in the lower crust, and the seismic data also aren't so good at identifying things in the mid crust here. So if I add the lower crust, some densities in here, good for the lower crust, and constrain the thickness to that the model can't let the Bushveld be more than 10 kilometers thick, we get this thickness for the Bushveld. And it's pretty reasonable, as I mentioned earlier. It's very similar to what we've seen before, 5 or 6 kilometers. It sees the feeders. It's pretty good. But for this, we were interested in what does the lower crust look like? See, what you see is this very thick zones focused right on the Thabazimbi merchant lineament. And it's thicker out here. It's thick under the feeders. So what does this mean? Here's some more pictures of it. Janine's profiles across here. This is the green is the Bushveld, and here's the thickness of the lower crust. These together, all this mafic material caused the crust to bow down, which Sue showed in earlier papers of gravity modeling, which is why the crust is thick here. But you see this lower crust, it's fairly thick. Thabazimbi merchants and lineament intersects it. This profile out here crosses this southern feeder. It's not as thick as in Janine's model, but you can see it's kind of compensated by slight updip in the lower crust. These things you have to take with a grain of salt, but it just shows that there's thick material here. This profile, this east-west profile, same kind of thing. You see the multiple farms, which is relatively thin. Far western lobe, intersection of the TML. Here's the Mokopani feeder. Lower crust wants to come up here. Clearly a connection here. We don't always see these things. They can get thin and you don't see the density contrast, not well constrained, but likely this is a feeder and it was somehow connected to the lower crust. So what does this show us? The addition of the dense lower crust allows us to fit the gravity data and have reasonable thicknesses for the Bushveld. The thickest dense lower crust coincides with where the crust is thickest and has mafic composition and diffuse crust mantle transition. These faults, all these major faults, some of which we think were conduits for the Bushveld, intersect this high density lower crust with these feeders. And we think there's a connection between the dense material in the lower crust and the Bushveld. And can the lower crust be remnants of staging chambers? Okay, Rice, this is for you. So this picture's these different models for how the Bushveld is, where there's a big magma tank or amalgamated sills or transcrustal mush-dominated magma plumbing system. I work a lot on volcanoes, and this is the model that is preferred for certainly subduction zone volcanoes. Having staging chambers in the lower part of the lower crust or mid crust explains various geochemical signatures, explains the chromium paradox. So you got a staging chamber here. It explains heterogeneous plagioclase in the lower main zone of the northern lobe. This is Yao's work based on thermodynamic modeling, where he wants staging chambers in the upper and the lower crust and mid crust. We definitely see this, and this is totally possible. We're just not, we can put these kinds of things in our gravity model and fit the data. It's just not required. What do we see elsewhere? Mount St. Helens. This is the link between staging chambers and structures. There's this is from MT data, magnetotelluric data. There's a low resistivities here. It's interpreted as melt. And there are big faults. This is a seismic zone here, all around Mount St. Helens, clearly localized Mount St. Helens, possibly Mount Adams. Hawaii is a really great example. This paper, I guess I lost the citation, is from Wilding et al. 2022, which tracked earthquakes at Kilauea in last year. And what you see, there's different kind of earthquakes. Some kinds are indicating fluid movement, other kinds indicate cracking. Here are earthquakes associated with a mantle staging chamber. It's a mantle source for magmas. It goes into a staging chamber. You can see these diffuse areas of seismicity. They're actually falling faults that come up to the surface. In the case of Kilauea, there's a shallow magma chamber, which you know from lots of data, and it erupted in Kilauea. Here's a picture of what it looks like, and they have great movies in here where you can actually see the earthquakes coming in these lines and making these sills. So you have the sills as staging chambers using faults in the mantle and in the crust. In the case of Kilauea, you had shallow magma chamber. The caldera collapsed, pressurizing the magma chamber, and it shot the magma right down the East Rift system that came out 50 kilometers down into housing development. Maybe that's a little bit how the Great Dike formed too. So in modern times, we have links between structures and magma. You can see that I did this slide, not Janine, because it's crazy. But what I'm just trying to show you is what geophysical images do we have of these staging chambers in other places. And I picked other places with high magma production rates. So that would be the East African Rift system. These are VP, this is a VP, and this is VS. What you see are low seismic velocities at about 10 to 15, 20 kilometers here and here. They're discrete bodies, maybe a 4 to 20% melt. It's the typical numbers that you see. So it's more of a mush. Melt is usually greater than 60%. A longer seismic profile across here sees high velocities in the lower crust that are thought to be staging chambers for the system, and it's much broader than where the actual magmatism is. And these are older because that's why it's high velocities. Similarly, other parts of the rift, high velocities in the lower crust. These are high velocities indicating intrusions at mid-crustal levels, former magma chambers. This is a diagram based on seismic attenuation data for, I can't say it. So tell me again, it's a little, this is where the carbonatites are coming out at the surface. It's pretty fantastic. We know there's tons of magma. There's so much CO2. And they have a lower crustal melt reservoir, sills in the mid crust, feeding some of the volcanic eruptions, or big faults going all the way down to the staging chamber and pouring out carbonatites. The mid-ocean ridges, actually in Bolivia, this is an MT profile. These red colors, once again, are very low resistivities. This is interpreted as a melt mush zone, 4 to 20% melt. And you see this feature in a lot of these volcanic areas where you've got crustal conductors in the mid to lower crust. It's not very well constrained, the thickness, but once again, these are staging chambers. Up here, these blobs, says Wolfgang is talking. Some of them are hydrothermal alteration and some of them might be magma bodies. We can learn a lot actually from the oceans. I hadn't looked at what's been going on in geophysical data in the oceans in a long time. And it's pretty spectacular. These are seismic reflection data. And they are seeing, these reflectors are off the top of a magmatic lens. So I picked these specific rise because it's a fast spreading center. And I think the melt percentage is 30 to 35% in these axial lenses. They're small, And they're not completely continuous along the axis. They're discrete bodies of magmatism. Underneath in the mid crust, melt, mush. The source is the source of the magma is in the mantle and in the lower crust as well. You've got, once again, staging chambers here. These are very ephemeral. These shallow parts of the system are pretty ephemeral. They can drain. They look like that. You might see a little melt or nothing at all. In all of these systems, the main places for the magma storage is in the lower and mid crust. Anything in the upper crust, upper 10 kilometers, tends to be ephemeral. Just a summary of everything. The gravity modeling shows a link between the lower crust and structures. We think that there's staging chambers. They also can use staging chambers explain a lot of the geochemical complexities in the Bushveld, as well as thermodynamic modeling. We see examples of the links between staging chambers and structures and magma melt regions in the lower crust. So we think that the lower crustal materials are remnants of staging chambers, not just in the Bushveld, but in the Duluth and in the other places we've looked. Thanks.
So we have 22 minutes for some comments and questions. I saw Bruce. Yeah, sure.
Hi again. If you look at the Bushveld as a whole, the southern lobe is pure upper zone. There is no critical zone, main zone, or anything else in the southern lobe. So that is kind of interesting from the thickness stuff that you're talking about. Secondly, most of your anomalous picture is where there is main zone in the main east-west part of the Bushveld, where there's main zone. So that magma came from a piece of mantle. That's a bit weird.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, our models are very homogenized, but there's at least in volcanic systems that I'm more familiar with, there's extreme heterogeneity in a little piece of, erupted rocks. So there's clearly different reservoirs. So even though we see this sort of broad picture, it's no problem. As I mentioned, they're just pockets of melt as opposed to this, there's no giant magma body underneath there from the geophysical data or from geochemistry. So yeah, having these different reservoirs, no problem. Where they are exactly is not always, we can't see it. Next one.
Thanks, fascinating. I was intrigued by one of your early diagrams where you show probably a 200 kilometer offset in the Tarbes-Murchison line, round about the middle section between the east and west slopes.
Where it goes, yeah.
I hadn't ever seen anyone putting that sort of offset anywhere in there, which effectively puts it as a single post Bushveld type age offset.
You mean just on the map where
just on the map, yes.
Yeah, that's Janine, it's all of these Afrikaans words like droid something or other.
It was one of the very early ones.
Yeah.
And
there are a lot.
The reason I'm asking is because Richard Hansen has got some paleomag suggesting motion between Cardiff and Zimbabwe, 1800 or so. So are you actually suggesting that there is a significant fault-related offset of that Tarbes-Murchison line as young as that?
Okay. No, I'm not suggesting that, but sure, I mean, that's
Okay, can we have one more?
yeah, it was actually probably.
Sorry, Moose, but that southeastern limb, if you come to my talk at 3:30 on Friday afternoon, you will see that in that Bethel lobe, there is upper, main, critical, and lower zone. So I'll be very interested in your data and talking to you, Carol, to see if you can indicate to me where the feeders might have been.
Okay, and maybe one last question.
Yao's had his hand up for a while.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No. Yes.
Yeah.
Many thanks for this very nice talk. I have just a little question. 13 is modeling. In the density of the low crest is assigned as maybe 13 to 100. Yeah, but I think if the mafic magma, it should be 27 to 2800. So I think if we use this density, can we say, oh, this low crest magma chamber is formed by the crest mash?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely.
Yeah, like Oliver, OPX, CTX, because that density is similar with
Right.
your
And
side.
remember, these are also solidified.
Okay, yes.
So if you look at
Maybe
them,
very little porosity.
yeah, so yeah, I mean, and there is, if you look at modern volcanic systems, as I mentioned, you don't see anybody come up with estimates of 60% or greater. They're all, they're all over the place. They're hard to estimate, but places like Yellowstone, yeah, they went from 10% to 20. It's all a mush.
Yeah, many thanks.
Okay.
Okay, one quick last one over there.
All right, maybe.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. I was just wondering, in your models, you have lateral variations in thickness, but the density remains constant. How realistic is that, and what happens if you laterally vary those densities?
Okay, so that's the question of how we do. So in order to try to get what are the ranges of things? One of the things that I like to do with modeling is not necessarily leave the model, but try to figure out what does it tell us. Yeah. So that's one way to pick n members. But what we finally ended up doing was starting out that way, letting the program kind of get the thickness of something that you think is reasonable based on geology and other constraints, and then fix it there and then vary the density. So yes. It's not going to be one density, and that, like in the Duluth complex, I showed those two pictures as well as installed. So yeah, it's not going to be definitely not going to be the same density, but if you're looking for thickness, kind of, it's.
Great, thanks again, Carol. So I'm going to have to ask Wolfgang to keep me on target on time. And I'm going to start with a couple of slides from my colleague, Musa Manzi, who unfortunately can't be here. And I just want to go through some of the very innovative work he's doing right now. He got a very large grant from Europe, working with one of his European colleagues, and they're implementing some very innovative geophysics in South Africa. So if you haven't seen this article from Mining Weekly, this is featuring the Future project. And I just want to read out what Future stands for. I'm not quite sure how they got the acronym, but it's fiber optic sensing and UAV platform techniques for innovative mineral exploration. Somehow they got Future out of that. But anyways, it's very, very clever. And this is an example of some of the work they're doing. This is from 7 months ago, and they brought these mini vibes, the seismic vibrator trucks, to South Africa. And these have been going all over the country, collecting data, new data. We're designing surveys, we're collecting data, we're processing data, we're interpreting data. I'd say we in the royal sense. I'm very little involved in this, but many of the students at WITS are. And you can see they're working at some of the mines. And then this is some of the group with some of the Europeans that have come over also. And the Future budget, it's not a small project. I mean, it's a 21 million Rand project. So it's a big project. It's largely driven by South African students and a number of European colleagues. So the South African government has also put money in it through the Department of Science and Innovation. They have the latest seismic sensors, mini vibes, and we just took delivery this week of one of the large vibrators, and they're in South Africa right now. There's tons of student support and lots of research projects. This is a message that Musa sent through the other day. It says we've completed surface active passive seismic experiments using collated DAS, the latest new MEMS broadband sensors, the 1Cs, the 3Cs, and this is the team that was working on that. They are collecting data on surface and underground, passive and active. So it's a very innovative project. This is the new large vibrator, just arrived on campus, an additional bigger vibe than the two mini vibes. So this is the 30-ton truck. This is them underground. They are taking fiber optic cable underground to use as in place essentially of seismometers. So one of the big innovations and one of the big problems with trying to run seismic underground is lack of precise timing. And so one of the innovations they've done is to actually get a relay to bring the GPS time clock underground. And they demonstrated this at our Saga conference last year, in November last year. It was the first time it had ever been done. At the conference, they brought the GPS time signal into the conference hall and demonstrated that it was working. So seismometers can now have GPS time. This has been an ongoing issue for in-mine seismic networks and any data you want to collect that requires precise timing. So it's very important they've been able to do this. So this is them actually getting the GPS time lock inside the tunnel at 3 kilometers depth below surface. And here's some of the young students, Kenneth and Umduduzu, I think. And they've also brought in this 5 kilogram weight drop, or 500 kilogram, excuse me, 500 kilogram weight drop. It runs on a little bobcat. Now, obviously this is an underground bobcat, so they've taken the whole top off so it can go into narrower areas. But if you go to my TikTok channel, you can, believe it or not, you can see a video of how this actually runs. So it's a very impressive 500 kgs, and it's assisted, so it slams into the ground at a great rate of speed, and it gives a very good signal. And they're actually recording the signal not only underground on the DAS fiber optic cable system, but they even record it on the surface. So now this is them. Here's the fiber optic cable being unrolled and then buried in the tunnels underground. So I don't know if how familiar you are with the DAS system, the distributed acoustic signal DAS cable at 3 kilometers depth, but this is a very good system for passive seismic. Oops, sorry. And this is some of the first data they got. This is, I know it looks like a modern art painting. I think it's quite cool. But this is essentially passive seismic signal from a passing train. So we want vibrations from all different locations and different directions and different frequency content for passive seismic. And this is, to me, this kind of summarizes it. This is the message we got yesterday from Musa, which was why I figured he wouldn't be here today. It was tense. We finally got 3 kilometers below surface. You can read all the words there faster than I can, but they finally had a successful day. And I know it always seems like it happens on the last day that you get your good data. And so they managed to get good data and collect, get all the systems working both above ground and below ground. So they're very excited about that.